On the morning of July 12, 2009, a housekeeper at the Ritz-Carlton in Westchester County, New York, knocked on the door of Suite 1104. No answer. She used her master key. What she found inside would unravel a marriage, a fortune, and two lives built entirely on performance and greed. Ben Novack Jr. lay dead on the bedroom floor. He had been beaten with such ferocity that investigators would later describe the scene in terms they rarely used out loud. His wrists were bound. His eyes had been gouged. There was no sign of forced entry. Someone he trusted had let the killers in. Ben Novack Jr. was not an ordinary man. He was the son of Ben Novack Sr., the legendary founder of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, the glittering palace of mid-century glamour where Frank Sinatra held court and the Rat Pack sprawled by the pool. Growing up in that world shaped Ben Jr. in ways that are impossible to overstate. He was obsessed with Batman, not casually, obsessively. His Fort Lauderdale home was a shrine to the character, Batman memorabilia filling every room. Batman logos on the furniture, Batman art on the walls. He threw elaborate themed parties, wore Batman costumes at events, and surrounded himself with people who either embraced his eccentricities or tolerated them for proximity to his money. By the time he died, Ben Jr. had parlayed his inherited wealth and connections into a successful convention business. He organized large-scale corporate events, the kind with thousands of attendees, complex logistics, and fees that ran into the millions. He was, by most accounts, extraordinarily good at it. He was also, by most accounts, extraordinarily difficult to love. His wife, Narcy Novack, had been with him for over a decade. She was Cuban-born, fiercely beautiful in a way that commanded attention, and utterly devoted to maintaining the lifestyle their marriage provided. Friends described her as controlling. Former employees described her as terrifying. Ben Jr. described her, in private conversations that would later surface in court, as the center of his world. He trusted her completely. That trust would cost him everything. Narcy's brother was Cristobal Veliz, known to everyone as Joel. Where Narcy moved through the world in silk and sunglasses, Joel operated in the shadows. He had a history that included prior arrests, a volatile temperament, and an absolute loyalty to his sister that investigators would come to see as the operational core of the entire conspiracy. The Ritz-Carlton staff had seen the Novacks arrive 2 days earlier. Ben was in Westchester to oversee a convention. Narcy was with him, as she usually was. But on the morning of July 11th, something happened in that suite. The night before his body was discovered, an event no security camera captured and no witness saw. What cameras did capture was Narcy Novack leaving the hotel at 2:47 a.m. and returning at 4:13 a.m. When detectives reviewed the footage, they noted the timing and moved on. At first, it would take months before they returned to that 86-minute window and began asking, where did she go, and who did she see? The initial investigation treated the murder as a potential robbery gone wrong. Ben Novack Jr. was wealthy. He traveled with valuables. The room showed evidence of a search, but something didn't fit. Experienced detectives know the difference between a robbery that turns violent and a violence that gets staged to look like robbery. The binding of his wrists was deliberate. The specific nature of his injuries suggested rage or instruction. This was personal. Westchester County investigators contacted Fort Lauderdale, where the Novacks maintained their primary residence. What they learned there complicated everything. In the months before Ben's death, there had been an incident. Narcy's mother, Bertha Backus, had been found at the bottom of the staircase inside the house. She died from her injuries. It had been ruled an accident. Ben Jr. had been present in the home that day. Now Ben Jr. was dead, and Narcy was alive. And investigators were beginning to see the shape of something they hadn't expected. They began pulling phone records. What they found was a web of communication between Narcy, Joel Veliz, and two men, Alejandro Garcia and Dennis Ramirez. They were not businessmen. They were individuals with criminal histories. No obvious legitimate reason to be in regular contact with the wife of a millionaire events promoter. The calls increased sharply in the weeks before July 12th. They went silent immediately after. Alejandro Garcia was arrested first. He was a former male stripper with a conviction record and a very bad habit of talking when cornered. Under questioning, Garcia confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. He and Ramirez had been hired. Hired to enter the suite. Hired to kill Ben Novack Jr. He claimed the order had come through a chain of contact. That led, inevitably, back to Joel Veliz. And Joel Veliz, Garcia said, was acting on behalf of his sister. The motive, when it emerged, was almost banal in its familiarity: money. Ben Novack Jr.'s estate was worth an estimated $10 million. His will left the bulk of it to Narcy. There was also life insurance and ongoing revenue from the convention business. But there was a prenuptial agreement Narcy found constraining. Ben, in his final months, quietly consulted attorneys about changes. Ben had told a business associate he was considering divorce. He hadn't acted, but Narcy knew, or suspected. For a woman who built her world on Ben's money, suspicion was apparently sufficient to trigger drastic actions. What followed the initial arrest was a legal process of extraordinary complexity. Garcia and Ramirez were charged with second-degree murder. Joel Veliz was charged as the coordinator. Narcy Novack, the architect of the conspiracy, faced a new charge. Her mother's death was no murder. Prosecutors alleged Narcy arranged her mother's death to prevent her from revealing details of the plot against Ben. She had eliminated a potential witness before the primary crime had even been committed. A chilling preemptive strike. The investigation began as a hotel murder, expanding across 2 states, involving 4 co-conspirators, and potentially 2 separate murders. One of these was hidden inside a staircase accident that police had closed and filed away, now reopened. The trials were conducted separately. Garcia pleaded guilty for a reduced sentence. Ramirez went to trial and was convicted. Joel Veliz went to trial in Florida, where evidence few courtroom observers anticipated was introduced. Investigators retrieved deleted text messages from Joel Veliz's phone. Not scrubbed, but forensically recovered with specialized equipment. These messages contained communications between Joel and plot-connected individuals, and with Narcy herself. One exchange, read aloud in court, discussed logistics in language leaving no room for interpretation. The source was undeniable. The timing aligned precisely with the window before Ben's death. The content confirmed coordination. Joel Veliz was convicted of first-degree murder in Ben Novack Jr.'s death and conspiracy in Bertha Bacchus's death. He received a life sentence. Narcy's trial came next, in federal court in New York. She retained high-profile defense counsel, maintaining her innocence. She claimed to be a grieving widow, scapegoated by investigators desperate to close a case. Her attorneys argued Garcia was a compromised witness, phone records circumstantial, and the 86-minute gap on hotel security footage meant nothing. But the prosecution had something more than Garcia's testimony and phone records. They had May Abad. May Abad was Narcy's personal assistant. She had worked for the Novacks for years, seen the inside of their marriage. She traveled with them to events, and maintained a front row seat to the dynamics of their household. On the stand, Abad testified that Narcy had spoken openly with her about wanting Ben dead. Not in the oblique, frustrated way that people vent in difficult marriages, but specifically, practically, logistically. Narcy had asked Abad, more than once, whether she knew anyone who could be hired. Abad had not reported the conversations. She had not believed, she said, that Narcy would actually act on them. She was wrong. Abad also testified about something that investigators had wondered about from the beginning: the injuries to Ben Novack's eyes. Garcia had confirmed that the attack on Ben's eyes had been a specific instruction, not random brutality. Someone had told the hired men to target them. Someone had known something about Ben that made his eyes particularly significant. Ben Novack Jr. was an avid boarder. He had an extensive collection of recordings made, in many cases, without the knowledge of the subjects. Narcy knew about this collection. She knew what it contained. She knew what existed on those recordings, and she knew what could surface if Ben were simply killed and his possessions left intact. The targeting of his eyes was, prosecutors argued, symbolic retribution, a message encoded in violence, directed at a man whose watching had been, in some profound way, the defining act of his private life. Whether or not the jury found that interpretation compelling, they found the overall case overwhelming. After deliberating for 3 days, they convicted Narcy Novack on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, murder in aid of racketeering, and obstruction of justice. She received 2 consecutive life sentences. She will die in federal prison. She was 61 years old at sentencing. She has maintained her innocence in every public statement she has made since. Her appeals have been denied. Ben Novack Jr. was 53 when he died. He had no children. His Batman collection, the one he had spent decades assembling with a collector's obsessive precision, was liquidated during probate proceedings. The Fontainebleau Hotel, his father's monument to a particular vision of American glamour, still stands on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach. It was renovated and reopened in 2008, a year before Ben died. He attended the reopening. By some accounts, it was one of the last genuinely happy nights of his life. What the Novack case illuminates is not exceptional. It is, in fact, a story told countless times in courtrooms across the country, wearing different names and different faces. A marriage built on access to wealth, an imbalance of power that curdles into resentment, and a choice made in cold calculation that the living partner would be better served by the dead one's assets than by the dead one's presence. The exceptional element here is the scope, to murders, for convicts. A conspiracy that required months of coordination, multiple hired hands, and the cold-blooded willingness to eliminate a frail elderly woman who might have talked. Narcy Novack sat in a federal courtroom and heard herself described by a prosecutor as someone who had treated human life as a variable in a financial equation. She showed very little. Those who watched her throughout the trial consistently described the same thing. A woman whose affect never broke, whose composure never cracked, who seemed to exist at some remove from the proceedings that would determine the rest of her life. Whether that composure was innocence or something else entirely, 12 jurors decided they already knew the answer. In the years since the conviction, former associates of the Novacks have spoken in interviews about the signs they believe they missed. The control, the isolation, the way Narcy managed access to Ben, decided who was allowed close and who was kept at arm's length. The way she spoke about money, not with enjoyment, but with a vigilance that some found unsettling even before they had reason to be unsettled. Hindsight is a flattening lens. It makes things look inevitable that were, in the moment, invisible. Ben Novack Jr. trusted his wife. He traveled with her, worked beside her, built a life with her, in a house full of Batman memorabilia and the distant echo of his father's golden age. On the night of July 11, 2009, she left their hotel room at 2:47 in the morning. She returned 86 minutes later. She knows what happened in those 86 minutes. She will take that knowledge with her for the rest of her life. The Ritz-Carlton suite has been occupied by hundreds of guests since that summer. Each one sleeps in the same space, beneath the same ceiling, unaware of what the walls once witnessed. That is the nature of rooms, and the nature of crime. The violence passes through, the building remains. And somewhere in a federal correctional facility, a woman who once lunched beside a hotel pool and wore designer sunglasses and called herself a widow stares at a different kind of ceiling and waits for a morning that will look exactly like the one before. There are other cases like this one, other marriages that curdled into conspiracy, other walls that witness things that cannot speak. If that particular darkness interests you, there are more stories in the corners of this channel, waiting, like all good secrets, to be found.